Whoops. Hit the button a little late today, folks. But welcome to the stream. We're going to be finishing up our read-through of The King in Yellow, I think. These last two stories are longer. So, we'll see how far we can get. Before we do, though, let's check in with the kitties. Once Across the Desk Cam is behaving, we'll be able to see that Ember and Sky are snuggled up real close there. I'll zoom in on them in a minute. And we have a triple down there on the second tree. We have Sammy looking out the window above, Mason on the upper platform, and then Sherbet down below the window looking out. So let's do some zoom in here. So you can see Ember in the back there all snuggled up. And then you can see the triple here with Mason napping and Sammy and Sherbet watching something. Fluffy indeed, Tass. Fluffy indeed. Hey there, casemate. Tass. Welcome to the stream. We have two more stories in The King in Yellow for tonight. I'm hoping that we get back into the King in Yellow centric content, because the last three weren't really in that territory. The prior one with the apparently the old cat and the what I presume is the dead woman, presumably the dead woman of the central person in the story, was okay, but again, not really on The King in Yellow. And prior to that, the Hawk story was interesting. Same issue, and I think overburdened by old French falconry terms. And then the bunch of little short poems or little short looping vignettes or something like that were okay. But hopefully the last two stories are going to get us back on track in that regard. Yeah. Yeah, I was discussing it with Tass, that particular short story, after the stream. And the idea that the main character was a falcon, and that everything was sort of a metaphor for how she acquired the falcon, trained it, and then that it eventually died. Especially the reinforcement of the gravestone with the falconry gauntlet on it. But yeah. Sammy is demanding attention, and her tail is hitting the camera, so devoting some effort to containing her. With much back scratching. There you go. No, you're not done? Okay. She's circling back around. I mean, it'd effectively just be like, kill, nap, wouldn't it, casemate? Ah, yes. let's switch on over. Let's start the story. So the first story for the night is The Street of the First Shell. Switch over to the chiller music here. Make sure all of the buttons are pressed properly. She's quite insistent. Getting some "you're doing it wrong" nips. She's doing that doing that thing where she puts her whole torso into leaning against your hand. And lean in, lower the lower the torso, and reduce the weight on those legs, and just tip the forehead right on. Hey. But yes, it is The Street of the First Shell, and its opening poem is in English for once. Let's see. Be of good cheer, the sullen month will die, and a young moon requite us by and by. Look how the old one, meager, bent, and wan, with age and fast is fainting from the sky. Okay. The room was already dark, the high roofs opposite cut off with what little remained of the December daylight. The girl drew her chair near the window and, choosing a large needle, threaded it, knotting the thread over her fingers. Then she smoothed the baby garment across her knees and, bending, bit off the thread and drew the smaller needle from where it rested in the hem. When she had brushed away the stray threads and bits of lace, she laid it again over her knees caressingly. Then she slipped the threaded needle from her corsage and passed it through a button. But as the button spun down the thread, her hand faltered. The thread snapped and the button rolled across the floor. She raised her head. Her eyes were fixed on a strip of waning light above the chimneys. Hey there, Poseidon. Welcome back. You are joining us for a reading of The King in Yellow. We're on the last two stories of the book. How have you been? From somewhere in the city came sounds like the distant beating of drums, and beyond, far beyond, a vague muttering, now growing, swelling, rumbling in the distance like the pounding of surf upon the rocks, now like surf again, receding, growling, menacing. The cold had become intense, a bitter, piercing cold which strained and snapped at the joist and beam, and turned the slush of yesterday to flint. From the street below, every sound broke sharp and metallic. The clatter of sabots, the rattle of shutters, or the rare sound of a human voice. Still at it, huh, Poseidon? Still at it. The air was heavy, weighted with the black cold as with a pall. To breathe was painful, to move an effort. In the desolate sky there was something that wearied, in the brooding clouds something that saddened. It penetrated the freezing city, cut by the freezing river, the splendid city with its towers and domes, its quays and bridges and its 1,000 spires. It entered the squares, it seized the avenues and the palaces, stole across bridges and crept among the narrow streets of the Latin Quarter, gray under the gray of the December sky. Sadness, utter sadness. A fine, icy sleet was falling, powdering the pavement with a tiny crystalline dust. It sifted against the window panes and drifted in heaps along the sill. The light at the window had nearly failed, and the girl bent low over her work. Presently, she raised her head, brushing the curls from her eyes. "Jack, dearest, don't forget to clean your palette." He said all right, and picking up the palette, sat down upon the floor in front of the stove. His head and shoulders were in the shadow, but the firelight fell across his knees and glimmered red on the blade of the palette knife. Full in the firelight beside him stood a color box. On the lid was carved J. Trent, École des Beaux-Arts, 1870. The inscription was ornamented with an American and a French flag. The sleet blew against the window panes, covering them with stars and diamonds, then, melting from the warmer air within, ran down and froze again in fern-like traceries. A dog whined, and the patter of small paws sounded on the zinc behind the stove. "Jack, dear, do you think Hercules is hungry?" The patter of small paws, to me, implies that, as is tradition, Hercules is a tiny dog. The patter of paws was redoubled behind the stove. "He's whining," she continued nervously. "And if it isn't because he's hungry, it is because..." Her voice faltered. A loud humming filled the air. The windows vibrated. "Oh, Jack," she cried, "another..." But her voice was drowned in the scream of a shell tearing through the clouds overhead. "That is the nearest yet," she murmured. "Oh no," he answered cheerfully. "It probably fell way over at Montmartre. Maybe Montmartre." And as she did not answer, he said again with exaggerated unconcern, "They wouldn't take the trouble to fire at the Latin Quarter. Anyway, they haven't a battery that can hurt it." After a while, she spoke up brightly. "Jack, dear, when are you going to take me to see Monsieur West's statue?" "I will bet," he said, throwing down his palette and walking over to the window beside her, "that Colette has been here today." "Why?" she asked, opening her eyes very wide. Then, "Oh, it's too bad." "Really, men are tiresome when they think they know everything. And I warn you that if Monsieur West is vain enough to imagine that Colette..." From the north, another shell came whistling and quavering through the sky, passing above them with a long-drawn screech, which left the windows singing. "That," he blurted out, "was too near for comfort." They were silent for a while when he spoke again gaily. "Go on, Sylvia, and whither poor West?" But she only sighed. "Oh dear, I can never seem to get used to the shells." He sat down on the arm of the chair beside her. Her scissors fell jingling to the floor. She tossed the unfinished frock after them and put both arms about his neck and drew him down into her lap. "Don't go out tonight, Jack." He kissed her uplifted face. "You know I must. Don't make it hard for me. But when I hear the shells and know you are out in the city..." "But they fall in Montmartre. They may fall in the Beaux-Arts. You said yourself that two struck the Quai d'Orsay." "Mere accident. Jack, have pity on me. Take me with you. And who will be here to get dinner?" She rose and flung herself on the bed. "Oh, I can't get used to it, and I know I must go, but I beg you not to be late to dinner. If you knew what I suffer, I cannot help it. You must be patient with me, dear." He said, "It is as safe there as it is in our own house." She watched him fill for her the alcohol lamp, and when he had lighted it and had taken his hat to go, she jumped up and clung to him in silence. After a moment he said, Now, Sylvia, remember my courage is sustained by yours. Come, I must go. She did not move, and he repeated, I must go. Then she stepped back, and he thought she was about to speak and waited. But she only looked at him, and, a little impatiently, he kissed her again, saying, Don't worry, dearest. When he had reached the last flight of stairs on his way to the street, a woman hobbled out of the housekeeper's lodge waving a letter and calling, Monsieur Jack, Monsieur Jack. This was left by Monsieur Fallowby. He took the letter and, leaning on the threshold of the lodge, read it. Cats dispersing. There we go. Oh, you can see Sherbet's little face in there. A lot of times he sleeps on his other side when he's in there, so you just see his tail. Dear Jack, I believe Braith is dead broke, and I'm sure Fallowby is. Braith swears he isn't, and Fallowby swears he is, so you can draw your own conclusions. I've got a scheme for a dinner, and if it works, I will let you fellows in. Yours faithfully, West. P.S. Fallowby has shaken Hartman and his gang, thank the Lord. There is something rotten there, or it may be he's only a miser. P.P.S. I'm more desperately in love than ever, but I'm sure she does not care a straw for me. All right, said Trent with a smile to the concierge. But tell me, how is Papa Cottard? The old woman shook her head and pointed to a curtained bed in the lodge. Pierre Cottard, she cried cheerily. How goes the wound today? He walked over to the bed and drew the curtains. An old man was lying among the tumbled sheets. Better? Smiled Trent. Better, repeated the man wearily, and after a pause, Have you any news, Monsieur Jack? I haven't been out today. I will bring you any rumor I may hear, though goodness knows I've got enough of rumors, he muttered to himself. Then aloud, Cheer up, you're looking better. And the sortie? Oh, the sortie, that's for this week. General Trochu sent orders last night. It will be terrible. It will be sickening, thought Trent as he went out into the street and turned the corner towards the Rue du Seine. Slaughter, slaughter, few. I'm glad I'm not going. So is this meant to be World War I? Don't know. Could be another alternate history kind of thing like the first story. But given the names of the places, I assume a French city, and it is being shelled. And given when the story was written and published, it was before 1927, so... Words. Lost my place. The street was almost deserted. A few women, muffled in tattered military capes, crept along the frozen pavement, and a wretchedly clad gamin hovered over the sewer hole on the corner of the boulevard. A rope around his waist held his rags together. From the rope hung a rat, still warm and bleeding. There's another in there, he yelled at Trent. I hit him, but he got away. Trent crossed the street and asked, How much? 2 francs for a quarter of a fat one. That's what they give at the Saint Germain market. A violent fit of coughing interrupted him, but he wiped his face with the palm of his hand and looked cunningly at Trent. Last week you could buy a rat for 6 francs, but... Here he swore vilely. The rats have quit the Rue du Seine, and they kill them now over by the new hospital. I'll let you have this for 7 francs. I can sell it for 10 in the Isle of St. Louis. You lie, said Trent, and let me tell you that if you try to swindle anybody in this quarter, the people will make short work of you and your rats. He stood a moment eyeing the gamin, who pretended to snivel. Then he tossed him a franc, laughing. The The child caught it and, thrusting it into his mouth, wheeled about to the sewer hole. For a second he crouched, motionless, alert, his eyes on the bars of the drain. Then, leaping forward, he hurled a stone into the gutter. And Trent left him to finish a fierce gray rat that writhed squealing in the mouth of the sewer. Suppose Braith should come to that, he thought. Poor little chap. And, hurrying, he turned to the dirty passage debut arts and entered the third house to the left. Unsure as at home, quavered the old concierge. Home? A garret absolutely bare save for the iron bedstead in the corner and the iron basin and pitcher on the floor. Lower this down a little bit. West appeared at the door, winking with much mystery, and motioned Trent to enter. Braith, who was painting in bed to keep warm, looked up, laughing, and shook hands. Any news? The perfunctory question was answered as usual by nothing but the cannon. Trent sat down on the bed. Where on earth did you get that? He demanded, pointing at a half-finished chicken nestling in a wash basin. West grinned. Are you millionaires, you two? Out with it. Braith, looking a little ashamed, began, Oh, it's one of West's exploits. But it was cut short by West, who said he would tell the story himself. You see, before the siege, I had a letter of introduction to a type here, a fat banker, German-American variety. You know the species, I see. Well, of course I forgot to present the letter, but this morning, judging it to be a favorable opportunity, I called on him. The villain lives in comfort. Fires, my boy, fires in the anterooms. The Buttons finally condescends to carry my letter and card up, leaving me standing in the hallway, which I did not like, so I entered the first room I saw and nearly fainted at the sight of a banquet on a table by the fire. Down comes Buttons, very insolent. No, oh no, his master is not at home, and in fact is too busy to receive letters of introduction just now. The siege and many business difficulties. I deliver a kick to Buttons, pick up his chicken from the table, toss my card onto the empty plate, and addressing Buttons as a species of Prussian pig, march out with the honors of war. Trent shook his head. I forgot to say that Hartman often dines there, and I draw my own conclusions, continued West. Now about this chicken. Half of it is for Braith and myself, and half for Colette. But of course you will help me eat my part, because I'm not hungry. Neither am I, began Braith, but Trent, with a smile at the pinched faces before him, shook his head, saying, What nonsense, you know I'm never hungry. West hesitated, reddening, and then sliced off Braith's portion, but not eating any himself, said good night, and hurried away to number 470 Rue Serpent, where lived a pretty girl named Colette, orphan after Sedan, and heaven alone knew where she got the roses in her cheeks, for the siege came hard on the poor. That chicken will delight her, but I really believe she's in love with West, said Trent. Then, walking over to the bed, See here, old man, no dodging. You know, how much have you left? The other hesitated and flushed. Come, old chap, insisted Trent. Braith drew a purse from beneath his bolster and handed it to his friend with a simplicity that touched him. 7 sons, he counted. You make me tired. Why on earth don't you come to me? I take it D, then it's like D-D ill, Braith. Ah, okay. It's essentially, I take it bleeping ill, Braith. How many times must I go over the same thing and explain to you that because I have money, it is my duty to share it, and your duty and the duty of every American to share it with me. Okay. Like, alternate history kind of thing? Maybe Civil War-ish? No. maybe? I don't know. Can't get a cent. The city's blockaded, and the American minister has his hands full, and all the German riffraff and deuce with all the German riffraff and deuce knows what. Why don't you act sensibly? I will, Trent, but it's an obligation that perhaps I can never even in part repay. I'm poor, and of course you'll pay me. If I were a usurer, I would take your talent for security. When you are rich and famous, don't, Trent. All right, only no more monkey business. He slipped a dozen gold pieces into the purse and, tucking it again under the mattress, smiled at Braith. Yeah, I'm having trouble placing the where as much. Because we know it's after, I think it was like after 1870 is when the little art palette thing was there. So it would make sense that it was later. And I mean, maybe it's like a foreign quarter in a city somewhere. How old are you? He demanded. 16. Brent laid his hand lightly on his friend's shoulder. I'm 22, and I have the rights of a grandfather as far as you're concerned. You'll do as I say until you're 21. The siege will be over then, I hope, said Braith. It can be a little tricky to spot when they've switched over to different people. Or at least I'm losing track now and again. But the prayer... let's see. The siege will be over by then, I hope, said Braith, trying to laugh, but the prayer in their hearts. How long, O Lord, how long, was answered by the swift scream of a shell soaring among the storm clouds of that December night. Into Chapter 2. Yeah, I'm not placing it. I mean, in general, it doesn't seem to matter so far. Hey there, me. Welcome. We are working through the second to last story in The King in Yellow. How are you doing? I mean, that could be it, casemate. The locations have a lot of French names. He said, we seem to be post, I think it was like 1870 or something like that. Good to hear, me. Good to hear. Pretty much all you can hope for is doing well at the moment. Or at least, it's the bar you should shoot for. West, standing in the doorway of a house in the Rue Serpentine, was speaking angrily. He said he didn't care whether Hartman liked it or not. He was telling him, not arguing with him. You call yourself an American, he sneered. Berlin and half are full of that kind of American. You come loafing about Colette with your pockets stuffed with white bread and beef, and a bottle of wine at 30 francs, and you can't really afford to give $1 to the American ambulance in public assistance, which Braith does, and he's half starved. Hartman retreated to the curbstone, but West followed him, his face like a thundercloud. Don't you dare call yourself a countryman of mine, he growled. No, nor an artist either. Artists don't worm themselves into the service of the public defense where they do nothing but feed like rats on the people's food. And I'll tell you now, he continued, dropping his voice, for Hartman had started as though stung. You might better keep away from that Alsatian brazier and the smug-faced thieves who who haunted. You know what they do with suspects. You lie, you hound, screamed Hartman, and flung the bottle in his hand straight at West's face. West had him by the throat in a second, and forcing him against the dead wall, shook him wickedly. Anybody else see Homer throttling Bart in that image? Why, you... Now you listen to me, he muttered through his clenched teeth. You're already a suspect, and, I swear, I believe you are a paid spy. It isn't my business to detect such vermin, and I don't intend to denounce you, but understand this. Colette don't like you, and I can't stand you, and if I catch you on this street again, I'll make it somewhat unpleasant. Get out, you sleek Prussian. Sleek. Hartman had managed to drag a knife from his pocket, but West tore it from him and hurled him into the gutter. A gamin who had seen this burst into a peal of laughter, which rattled harshly in the silent street. Then everywhere windows were raised and rows of haggard faces appeared, demanding to know why people should laugh in the starving city. Is it a victory? Murmured one. Look at that, cried West as Hartman picked himself up from the pavement. Look, you miser, look at those faces. But Hartman gave him a look which he never forgot, and walked away without a word. Trent, who suddenly appeared at the corner, glanced curiously at West, who merely nodded towards his door, saying, Come in, Fallowby's upstairs. What are you doing with that knife? Demanded Fallowby as he and Trent entered the studio. West looked at his wounded hand, which still clutched the knife, but saying, Cut myself by accident, tossed it into a corner and washed the blood from his fingers. Oh, so it's... He grabbed the knife and pulled it from him. Fallowby, fat and lazy, watched him without comment, but Trent, half divining how things had turned, walked over to Fallowby, smiling. I have a bone to pick with you, he said. Where is it? I'm hungry, replied Fallowby with affected eagerness. But Trent, frowning, told him to listen. How much did I advance you a week ago? 380 francs, replied the other with a squirm of contrition. Where is it? Fallowby began a series of intricate explanations, which were soon cut short by Trent. I know. You blew it in. You always blow it in. I don't care a rap what you did before the siege. I know you are rich and have a right to dispose of your money as you wish to. And I also know that, generally speaking, it is none of my business. But now it is my business, as I have to supply the funds until you get some more, which you won't until the siege is ended one way or another. I wish to share what I have, but I won't see it thrown out the window. Oh yes, of course I know you will reimburse me, but that isn't the question. And anyway, it's the opinion of your friends, old man, that you will not be worse off for a little abstinence from fleshly pleasure. You are positively a freak in this famished, cursed city of skeletons. I am rather stout. I am not. I'm just big-boned. Is it true you are out of money? Demanded Trent. Yes, I am, sighed the other. That roast-sucking pig on the Rue Saint-Honoré. Is it there yet? Continued Trent. What? At? Or, it's much like, what? Stammered the feeble one. Ah, I thought so. I caught you in ecstasy before that sucking pig at least a dozen times. Then, laughing, he presented Fallowby with a roll of 20-franc pieces, saying, If these go for luxuries, you must live on your own flesh, and went over to aid West, who sat beside the wash-basin binding up his hand. West suffered him to tie the knot, and then said, You remember yesterday when I left you in Braith to take the chicken to Colette? Chicken? Good heavens, moaned Fallowby. Chicken, repeated West, enjoying Fallowby's grief. That is, I must explain that things are changed. Colette and I are to be married. What about the chicken? Groaned Fallowby. This man has priorities, and they are roasted and crispy. Shut up, laughed Trent, and slipped his arm through Wes, walking to the stairway. The poor little thing, said West. Just think, not a splinter of firewood for a week, and wouldn't tell me because she thought I needed it for my clay figure. Ooh, when I heard it, I smashed that smirking clay nymph to pieces, and the rest can freeze and be hanged. After a moment, he added timidly, won't you call on your way down and say bonjour? It's number 17. Yes, said Trent, and he went out softly and closed the door behind. Buttons. He stopped on the third landing, lighted a match, scanned the numbers over the row of dingy doors, and knocked at number 17. Let's see. It looks like C'est Trois Georges, but I don't know. The door opened. Oh, pardon, Monsieur Jack. I thought it was Monsieur West. Then, blushing furiously, oh, I see you have heard. Thank you so much for your wishes, and I'm sure we love each other very much. And I'm dying to see Sylvia and tell her, and... And what? I am very happy, she sighed. He's pure gold, returned Trent, and then gaily, I want you and George to come and dine with us tonight. It's a little treat. You see, tomorrow is Sylvia's fete. She will be 19. I've written to Thorne, and the Guernalex will come with their cousin Odile. Or Odile, don't know. Fallowby has engaged not to bring anybody but himself. The girl accepted shyly, charging him with loads of loving messages to Sylvia, and he said goodnight. He started up the street, walking swiftly, for it was bitter cold, and cutting across the Rue de la Lune, he entered the Rue de Seine. The early winter night had fallen, almost without warning, but the sky was clear and the myriad of stars glittered in the heavens. The bombardment had become furious, a steady rolling thunder from the Prussian cannon punctuated by the heavy shocks from Mount Valerian? Valerian. The shells streamed across the sky, leaving trails like shooting stars, and now, as he turned to look back, rockets blue and red flared across the horizon from the fort of Issy, and the fortress of the north flamed like a bonfire. Good news, a man shouted over the Boulevard Saint-Germain. As if by magic, the streets were filled with people, shivering, chattering people with shrunken eyes. Let's see. Shacks, cried one. The army of the Loire. Unto it has come then at last. I told thee. Tomorrow, tonight, who knows? Is it true? Is it a sortie? Someone said, oh God, a sortie, and my son? Another cried, to the Seine? They say one can see the signals of the army of the... I'm gonna say lawyer. From the army of the... from Pont-Neuf. There was a child standing near Trent who kept repeating, Mama, Mama, then tomorrow we may eat white bread? And beside him, an old man swaying, stumbling, his shriveled hands crushed to his breast, muttering as if insane. Could it be true? Who has heard the news? The shoemaker up on the Rue de Bucci. No. French! Had it from a mobile who had heard a... Oh, man. Had heard somebody repeat it to a captain of the National Guard. Okay, we're going to start substituting words. Trent followed the throng surging through the Rue de Seine to the river. Rocket after rocket clove the sky, and now, from from Montmartre, the cannon clanged, and the batteries of the Montparnasse joined in with a crash. The bridge was packed with people. Trent asked, "Who has seen the signals of the army?" "We are waiting for them," was the reply. He looked towards the north. Suddenly, the huge silhouette of the Arc de Triomphe sprang into the black relief against the flash of a cannon. The boom of the guns rolled along the quay, and the old bridge vibrated. Again, over the point, a flash and heavy explosion shook the bridge, and then the whole eastern bastion of the fortifications blazed and crackled, sending a red flame into the sky. "Has anyone seen the signals yet?" he asked again. "We are waiting," was the reply. "Yes, waiting," murmured a man behind him. "Waiting, sick, starved, freezing, but waiting." "Is it a sortie? They go gladly." "Is it to starve? They starve." "They have no time to think of surrender. They are heroes. These Parisians, answer me, Trent." The American ambulance surgeon turned about and scanned the parapets of the bridge. "Any news, doctor?" asked Trent mechanically. "News," said the doctor. "I don't know any. I haven't time to know any. What were these people after?" "They say that the army has signaled the Mount Valérien." "Poor devils." The doctor glanced about him for an instant, and then, "I'm so harried and worried that I don't know what to do. After the last sortie, we had the work of 50 ambulances on our poor little corps. Tomorrow there's another sortie, and I wish you fellows could come over to the headquarters. We may need volunteers. How is the madam?" he added abruptly. "Well," replied Trent, "but she seems to grow more nervous every day. I ought to be with her now." "Take care of her," said the doctor, with a sharp look at the people. "I can't stop now. Good night." And he hurried away, muttering, "Poor devils." Trent leaned over the parapet and blinked at the black river surging through the arches. Dark objects, carried swiftly on the breast of the current, struck with a grinding, tearing noise against the stone piers, spun around for an instant, and hurried away in the darkness. The ice of the Marne. As he stood staring into the water, a hand was laid on his shoulder. "Hello, Southwark," he cried, turning around. "This is a strange place for you." "Trent, I have something to tell you. Don't stay here. Don't believe in the army." The attaché of the American legation slipped his arm through Trent's and drew him toward the Louvre. "Then it's another lie," said Trent bitterly. "Worse. We know at the legation. I can't speak of it. But that's not what I have to say. Something happened this afternoon. The Alsatian Brasserie was visited, and an American named Hartman has been arrested. Do you know him?" "I know a German who calls himself an American. His name is Hartman." "Well, he was arrested about 2 hours ago. They mean to shoot him." "What?" "Of course, we at the legation can't allow them to shoot him offhand, but the evidence seems conclusive." "Is he a spy?" "Well, the papers seized in his room are pretty damning proofs. And besides, he was caught, they say, swindling the Public Food Committee. He drew rations for 50. How, I don't know. He claims to be an American artist here, and we have been obliged to take notice of it at the legation. It's a nasty affair." "To cheat the people at such time is worse than robbing the poor box," cried Trent angrily. "Let them shoot him. He's an American citizen." "Yes, oh yes," said the other with bitterness. "American citizenship is a precious privilege when every goggle-eyed German his anger choked him." Southwark shook hands with him warmly. "It can't be helped. We must own the carrion. I'm afraid you may be called upon to identify him as an American artist," he said with the ghost of a smile on his deep-lined face, and walked away through the Cours la Reine. Trent swore silently for a moment and then drew out his watch. 7 o'clock. Sylvia will be anxious, he thought, and hurried back to the river. The crowd still huddled shivering on the bridge. A somber, pitiful congregation peering out into the night for the signals of the army. And their hearts beat time to the pounding of the guns, their eyes lighted with each flash from the bastions, and hope rose with the drifting rockets. A black cloud hung over the fortifications. From horizon to horizon, the cannon smoke stretched in wavering bands, now capping the spires and domes with cloud, now blowing in streamers and shreds along the street, now descending from the housetops, enveloping quays, bridges, and river in a sulphurous mist. And through the smoke pall, the lightning of the cannon played, while from time to time a rift above showed a fathomless black vault set with stars. He turned onto the Rue de Seine, that sad abandoned street with its rows of closed shutters and desolate ranks of unlighted lamps. He was a little nervous and wished once or twice for a revolver, but the slinking forms which passed him in the darkness were too weak with hunger to be dangerous, he thought, and he passed on unmolested to his doorway. But there somebody sprang at his throat. Over and over the icy pavement he rolled with his assailant, tearing at the noose about his neck, and then with a wrench sprang to his feet. "Get up," he cried to the other. Slowly and with great deliberation, a small gamin picked himself out of the gutter and surveyed Trent with disgust. "That's a nice clean trick," said Trent, "a whelp of your age. You'll finish against a dead wall. Give me that cord." The urchin handed him the noose without a word. Trent struck a match and looked at his assailant. It was the rat killer from the day before. "I thought so," he muttered. It says something in French. The impudence, the overpowering audacity of the ragamuffin took Trent's breath away. "Do you know, you young strangler," he gasped, "that they shoot thieves of your age?" The child turned a passionless face to Trent. "Shoot, then." That was too much, and he turned on his heel and entered his hotel. Groping up the unlighted stairway, he at last reached his own landing and felt about in the darkness for the door. From his studio came the sound of voices, West's hearty laugh and Fallowby's chuckle, and at last he found the knob and, pushing back the door, stood a moment confused by the light. I like how how blasé he is about being accosted by a child, a child trying to strangle him in the dark. That, above a lot of things, sets the tone of the time here. "Hello, Jack," cried West. "You're a pleasant creature, inviting people to dine and letting them wait. Here's Fallowby weeping with hunger." "Shut up," observed the latter. "Perhaps he's been out to buy a turkey." "He's been out garroting. Look at his noose," laughed Guernalec. "So now we know where you get your cash," added West. Vive le coup de Père Francois." Trent shook hands with everybody and laughed at Sylvia's pale face. "I didn't mean to be late. I stopped on the bridge a moment to watch the bombardment. Were you anxious, Sylvia?" She smiled and murmured, "Oh, no," but her hand dropped to his and tightened convulsively. "To the table," shouted Fallowby, and uttered a joyous whoop. Once again, this man has particular priorities, and they are likely savory. That is true, Tass. If this were a modern movie, that would absolutely be the case. This wouldn't be showing how dire the straits of the population is. This would be an opportunity to show that the main character knows Kung Fu, is is a total master at it, and is also merciful despite how people have treated him. Look how amazing he is. In this case, it's just sad. Though one would have to appreciate the additional explosions that would happen in the modern telling. You know, instead of leaping out of the shadows, the kid probably would have hurled himself off a rooftop, guns blazing. Slow motion, doves flying around, that kind of thing. Let's see. Take it easy, observed Thorn, with a remnant of manners. You are not the host, you know. Marie Guernalec, who had been chattering with Colette, jumped up and took Thorn's arm, and Monsieur Guernalec drew Odile's arm through his. Trent, bowing gravely, offered his arm to Colette. West took in Sylvia, and Fallowby hovered anxiously in the rear. You march around the table 3 times, singing Marseillais, explained Sylvia, and Monsieur Fallowby pounds on the table and beats time. Fallowby suggested that they could sing after dinner, but his protest was drowned in the ringing chorus. French singing. Around the room they marched singing with all their might, while Fallowby, with very bad grace, hammered on the table, consoling himself a little with the hope that the exercise would increase his appetite. Hercules, the black and tan, fled under the bed, from which retreat and he yapped and whined until dragged out by Guernalec and placed in Odile's lap. And now, said Trent gravely, when everybody was seated, listen, and he read the menu. Let's see, it's like beef soup of the Siege of Paris, fish, let's see, sardines with white wine, something with red wine. It was fresh beef from the sortie, vegetables, which is, let's see, canned beans, canned peas, potatoes, and miscellaneous, cold corned beef, stewed prunes. Dessert is, let's see, dried prunes and white bread, currant jelly, tea, liquor, and pipes and cigarettes. That's another sign of the times, that part of the dessert course is, and then we'll go smoke. Fallowby applauded frantically, and Sylvia served the soup. Isn't it delicious? Sighed Odile. Marie Guernalec sipped at her soup in rapture. All the explosions are not shelling tasks. They are all Gordon, like somebody akin to. Wouldn't be Iron Chef if it was that. I know Gordon Ramsay had one that was akin to Iron Chef. That came later. Saying it wasn't cannon fire, it was Gordon Ramsay berating people. Not at all like horse, and I don't care what they say. Horse doesn't taste like beef, whispered Colette to West. Fallowby, who had finished, began to caress his chin and eye the tureen. Have some more, old chap? Inquired Trent. Monsieur Fallowby cannot have any more, announced Sylvia. I'm saving this for the concierge. Fallowby transferred his eyes to the fish. Now, a Lovecraftian Iron Chef, a cosmic horror Iron Chef. Now that would be a show. And you could do it a couple of different ways, you know. It could be strange, unknowable horrors cooking mundane things, or mundane people cooking strange, unknowable horrors. Today's secret ingredient is Chthonian steak. Fresh fillets supplied by the ghouls. Fresh mice from Ulthwar, you know? The sardines, hot from the grill, were a great success. While the others were eating, Sylvia ran downstairs with the soup for the old concierge and her husband. And when she hurried back, flushed and breathless, and had slipped into her chair with a happy smile at Trent, that young man arose and silence fell over the table. See, that would be another interesting thing, is and I wonder if it already exists, is a cookbook to the tune of the old cheesy House of Horrors tricks. You know how it's like, oh, this is, spaghetti and grapes, and they're like intestines and eyeballs and brains and stuff. Instead of it relying on touch and in darkness, instead you go for preparation methods that make it look horrifying, but is actually delicious. You could even bind up the book in tattered leather kind of stuff to give it that extra creepy vibe. Make the pages all yellowed and crackly looking. Red irregular ink. No, reddish brown. Add in some occasional pages of just incoherent rambling, like my stream. For an instant he looked at Sylvia and thought he had never seen her so beautiful. "You all know," he began, "that today is my wife's 19th birthday." Fallowby, bubbling with enthusiasm, waved his glass in circles about his head to the terror of Odile and Colette. His neighbors in Thorn, West and Guernalec refilled their glasses 3 times before the storm of applause which the toast of Sylvia had provoked subsided. 3 times the glasses were filled and emptied to Sylvia, and again to Trent, who protested. Yeah, we don't get an idea of when they got married. I mean, at the very least, it's definitely on the verge of the lower creepy range, I don't know what the age gap limit for that is. I know the age gap that ceases to be creepy widens substantially as you get older. That's right, casemate. At least it's legal as of right now. "This is irregular," he cried. "The next toast is to the twin republics, France and America." To the republics, they cried, and the toast was drunk amid shouts of "Vive la France! Vive la America! Vive la nation!" There's an equation for it, you say? Then Trent, with a smile at West, offered the toast. to a happy pair. And everybody understood, and Sylvia leaned over and kissed Colette while Trent bowed to West. The beef was eaten in comparative calm, but when it was finished and a portion of it set aside for the old people below, Trent cried, "Drink to Paris! May she rise from her ruins and crush the invader!" And the cheers rang out, drowning for a moment the monotonous thunder of the Prussian guns. Reminds me of that conversation that we had about a perfect algorithm, and whether whether divine math would still include some concept of fundamental variability or not. Is there essentially a primal number that means a random number? Pipes and cigarettes were lighted, and Trent listened an instant to the animated chatter around him, broken by ripples of laughter from the girls or the mellow chuckle of Fallowby. Then he turned to West. "There is going to be a sortie tonight," he said. "I saw the American ambulance surgeon just before I came in, and he asked me to speak to you fellows. Any aid we can give him will not come amiss." Then, dropping his voice and speaking in English, "As for me, I shall go out with the ambulance tomorrow morning. There is, of course, no danger, but it's just as well we keep it from Sylvia." West nodded. Thorn and Guernalec, who had heard, broke in and offered assistance, and Fallowby volunteered with a groan. "All right," said Trent rapidly. "No more now, but meet at the ambulance headquarters tomorrow morning at 8. Sylvia and Colette, who were becoming uneasy at the conversation in English, now demanded to know what they were talking about. "What does a sculptor usually talk about?" cried West with a laugh. Odile glanced reproachfully at Thorn, her fiancé. "You are not French, you know, and it's none of your business, this war," said Odile with much dignity. Thorn looked meek, but West assumed an air of outraged virtue. "It seems," he said to Fallowby, "that a fellow cannot discuss the beauties of Greek sculpture in his mother tongue without being openly suspected." Colette placed her hand over his mouth and, turning to Sylvia, murmured, "They are horridly untruthful, these men." "I believe the word for ambulance is the same in both languages," said Marie Guernalec saucily. "Sylvia, don't trust Monsieur Trent." "Jack," whispered Sylvia, "promise me." A knock at the studio door interrupted her. "Come in," cried Fallowby, but Trent sprang up and opened the door, opening the door, looked out. Then, with a hasty excuse to the rest, he stepped into the hallway and closed the door. When he returned, he was grumbling. "What is it, Jack?" cried West. "What is it?" repeated Trent savagely. "I'll tell you what it is. I've received a dispatch from the American minister to go at once and identify and claim as a fellow countryman and a brother artist a rascally thief and a German spy." "Don't go," suggested Fallowby. "If I don't, they'll shoot him at once." "Let them," growled Thorn. "Do you fellows know who it is?" "Hartman," shouted West, inspired. Sylvia sprang up deathly white, but Odile slipped her arm around her and supported her to a chair, saying calmly, "Sylvia has fainted. It's the hot room. Bring some water." Trent brought it at once. Sylvia opened her eyes and, after a moment, rose, and, supported by Marie Guernalec and Trent, passed into the bedroom. It was the signal for breaking up, and everybody came and shook hands with Trent, saying they hoped Sylvia would sleep it off and that it would be nothing. When Marie Guernalec took her leave, she avoided his eyes, but he spoke to her cordially and thanked her for her aid. "Anything I can do, Jack?" inquired West, lingering in her, and then hurried downstairs to catch up with the rest. Brett leaned over the banisters, listening to their footsteps and chatter. Then the lower door banged and the house was silent. He lingered, staring down into the darkness, biting his lips. Then, with an impatient movement, "I am crazy," he muttered, and, lighting a candle, went into the bedroom. Sylvia was lying on the bed. He bent over her, smoothing the curly hair on her forehead. "Are you better, dear Sylvia?" She did not answer, but raised her eyes to his. For an instant he met her gaze, but what he read there sent chills to his heart, and he sat down, covering his face with his hands. At last she spoke in a voice changed and strained, a voice which he had never heard, and he dropped his hands and listened, bolt upright in his chair. "Jack, it has come at last. I feared it and trembled. Ah, how often I have lain awake at night, with this on my heart, and prayed that I might die before you should ever know of it. For I love you, Jack, and if you go away, I cannot live. I have deceived you. It happened before I knew you, but since that first day, when you found me weeping in the Luxembourg and spoke to me, Jack, I have been faithful to you in every thought and deed. I loved you from the first, and did not dare tell you this, fearing that you would go away, and since then my love has grown, and oh, I suffered. But I dared not tell you, and now you know, but you do not know the worst. For him now, what do I care? He was cruel, oh so cruel." She hid her face in her arms. "Must I go on? Must I tell you? Can you not imagine, Jack?" He did not stir. His eyes seemed dead. "I was so young, and I knew nothing, and he said that he loved me." Jack rose and struck the candle with his clenched fist, and the room was dark. The bells of St. Sulpice told the hour, and she started up, speaking with a feverish haste. "I must finish. When you told me you loved me, you asked me nothing, but then, even then, it was too late, and that other life which binds me to him must stand forever between you and me, for there is another whom he has claimed and is good to. He must not die. They cannot shoot him for the other's sake." Brent sat motionless, but his thoughts ran on in an interminable whirl. Sylvia, little Sylvia, who shared with him his student life, who bore with him the dreary desolation of the siege without complaint, this slender, blue-eyed girl who was so quietly fond of him, whom he teased or caressed at the as the whim suited, who sometimes made him the least bit impatient with her passionate devotion to him. Could this be the same Sylvia who lay weeping there in the darkness? When he clenched his teeth, let him die, but then, for Sylvia's sake and, for the other's sake, yes, he would go. He must go. His duty was plain before him. But Sylvia... He could not be what he had been to her, and yet a vague terror seized him. Now all was said, trembling, he struck a light. She lay there, her curly hair tumbled about her face, her small white hands pressed to her breast. He could not leave her, and he could not stay. He never knew before that he loved her. She had been a mere comrade, this girl wife of his. Wow, see, that harkens back to the "he likes 'em young" line there. That is not... I mean, it's not a great way to phrase it outside of context. It's not. He loved her now with all his heart and soul, and he knew it only when it was too late. Too late? Why? Then he thought that the other one, binding her, linking her forever to the creature, who stood in danger of his life. With an oath he sprang to the door, but the door was not open. Or was it that he pressed it back, locked it, and flung himself on his knees beside the bed, knowing that he dared not for his life's sake, leave from what was his all in life? I have to assume that maybe it's another one of those, its usage is, like, that phrase's usage is very different at the time, but it sound bad. It sound really bad. Especially given how they celebrated her 19th at the time. At least from a modern reading, it gives us an implication that they've been married a bit. Chapter 3. It was 4 in the morning when he came out of the prison of the condemned with the secretary of the American legation. A knot of people had gathered around the American minister's carriage, which stood in front of the prison. The horses stamping and pawing in the icy street. The coachman huddled on the box, wrapped in furs. Ah, okay. Even then. And I know the word origin for girl is essentially child. It didn't diverge into a gendered word until later. And I think that was largely because there was a different term that started to be used for male children at some point. But yeah, according to Tass, it sounds like it means something like effectively common law marriage. Makes some sense. What was it? It was, if the imagery or terminology you're using requires that you have a robust explanation for it in order to make it not seem as bad as it sounds or looks, then you probably ought not use that terminology or imagery. Again, this is an old book, so it's not the same case. But it is the classic anime problem of, yeah, she looks like that, but she's actually 1,000 years old. It's like, yeah, but you had to tell me that for me to know. Let's see. A lot of people had gathered around. The coachman huddled on the box, wrapped in furs. Southwark helped the secretary into the carriage and shook hands with Trent, thanking him for coming. How the scoundrel did stare, he said. Your evidence was worse than a kick. But it saved his skin for the moment, at least, and prevented complications. The secretary sighed. We have done our part. Now let them prove him a spy, and we wash our hands of him. Jump in, Captain. Come along, Trent. I have a word to say to Captain Southwark. I won't detain him, said Trent hastily, and dropping his voice. Southwark, help me now. You know the story from the blackguard. You know the child is at his rooms. Get it and take it to my own apartment. And if he is shot, I will provide a home for it. I understand, said the captain gravely. Will you do this at once? At once, he replied. Their hands met in a warm clasp, and then Captain Southwark climbed into the carriage, motioning Trent to follow. But he shook his head, saying, "Goodbye," and the carriage rolled away. He watched the carriage to the end of the street, then started toward his own quarter. I really do hope that we're going to get to something king and yellowy, because this seems as much like a period story right now. Like, entirely a period drama kind of thing. I came here for cosmic horror. At least flash some tentacle or something like that. Come on. Watched the carriage to the end of the street and then started toward his own quarter, but after a step or two hesitated, stopped, and finally turned away in the opposite direction. Something, Perhaps it was the sight of the prisoner he had so recently confronted nauseated him. He felt the need of solitude and quiet to collect his thoughts. The events of the evening had shaken him terribly, but he would walk it off, forget, bury everything, and then go back to Sylvia. I know, right, casemate? Sometimes what you want is some sort of horrible, sanity-devouring blob of unknown darkness, but we can't always have what we want. We have to make do. The events of the evening had shaken him. Let's see. He started on swiftly, and for a time the bitter thoughts seemed to fade. But when he paused at last, breathless under the Arc de Triomphe, the bitterness and the wretchedness of the whole thing, yes, of his whole misspent life, came back with a pang. Then the face of the prisoner, stamped with the horrible grimace of fear, grew in the shadows before his eyes. Sick at heart, he wandered up and down under the great arc, striving to occupy his mind, peering up at the sculptured cornices to read the names of the heroes and battles which he knew were engraved there. But always the ashen face of Hartman followed him, grinning with terror. Or was it terror? Was it not triumph? At the thought, he leapt like a man who feels a knife at his throat, but after a savage tramp round the square, came back again, and sat down to battle with his misery. The air was cold, but his cheeks were burning with angry shame. Shame? Why? Was it because he had married a girl whom chance had made a mother? Did he love her? Well, my opinion of this guy is becoming unstable. Was this miserable bohemian existence, then, his end and aim in life? He turned his eye upon the secrets of his heart and read an evil story, the story of the past, and he covered his face for shame. While keeping time to the dull pain throbbing in his head, his heart beat out the story for the future, shame and disgrace. Roused at last from a lethargy which had begun to numb the bitterness of his thoughts, he raised his head and looked about. A sudden fog had settled in the streets. The arches of the arc were choked with it. He would go home. A great horror of being alone seized him. But he was not alone. The fog was peopled with phantoms. All around him in the mist they moved, drifting through the arches in lengthening lines, and vanished, while from the fog others rose up, swept past, and were engulfed. He was not alone, for even at his side they crowded, touching him, swarmed before him, beside him, behind him, pressed him back, seized and bore him with them through the mist. Down a dim avenue, through lanes and alleys white with fog, they moved, and if they spoke, their voices were dull as the vapor which shrouded them. At last, in front of a bank of masonry and earth cut by a massive iron-barred gate, towering up in the fog, slowly and more slowly they glided, shoulder to shoulder and thigh to thigh. Hey there, is it Talionos? Or Talionos? Either way, whatever way. Welcome to the stream. Good to see you. Glad you could make it. We are aiming to finish up our read-through of The King in Yellow, but I may have bit off more than I can chew. And I need to find my beverage here. Talionos. Okay. Neat. Again, glad you could make it. Where did you first find out about my streams? Then all movement ceased. A sudden breeze stirred the fog. It wavered and eddied. Objects became more distinct. A pallor crept above the horizon, touching the edges of the watery clouds, and drew dull sparks from 1,000 bayonets. Bayonets, they were everywhere, cleaving the fog or flowing beneath it like in rivers of steel. Well, thank you. I appreciate the sub. I hope you enjoy the streams. We are in the midst of a bit of a variety week. Today is reading a book, and then we're going to have a couple of different games on the weekend. Have you met the cats? We can see 2 of them there. Let's see. High on the wall of masonry and earth, a great gun loomed, and around it, figures moved in silhouettes. Below, a broad torrent of bayonets swept through the iron-barred gateway, out into the shadowy plain. It became lighter. Faces grew more distinct among the marching masses, and he recognized one. You, Philippe. The figure turned its head. Trent cried, "Is there room for me?" But the other only waved his arm in a vague adieu and was gone with the rest. Presently the cavalry began to pass, squadron on squadron, crowding out into the darkness. Then many a cannon, then an ambulance, then again the endless lines of bayonets. Beside him, a cuirassier sat on his steaming horse, and in front, among a group of mounted officers, he saw a general, with the astrakhan collar of his dolman turned up about his bloodless face. Some women were weeping near him, and one was struggling to force a loaf of black bread into a soldier's haversack. The soldier tried to aid her, but the sack was fastened and his rifle bothered him, so Trent held it while the woman unbuttoned the sack and forced in the bread, now all wet with her tears. The rifle was not heavy. Trent found it wonderfully manageable. Was the bayonet sharp? He tried it. Then, with a sudden longing, a fierce, imperative desire took possession of him. "Something in French," cried a gamin, clinging to the barred gate. "Yet more French." Trent looked up, and the rat killer laughed in his face, but when the soldier had taken the rifle again, and thanking him, ran hard to catch his battalion, he plunged into the throng about the gateway. "Are you going?" he cried to a Marine who sat in the gutter bandaging his foot. "Yes." Then a girl, a mere child, caught him by the hand and led him into the cafe, which faced the gate. The room was crowded, with soldiers, some white and silent, sitting on the floor, others groaning on leather-covered settees. The air was sour and suffocating. "Choose," said the girl with a little gesture of pity. "They can't go." In a heap of clothing on the floor, he found a uniform. She helped him buckle his knapsack, cartridge box, and belt, and showed him how to load the rifle, holding it on her knees. When he thanked her, she started to her feet. You are a foreigner." "American," he said, moving toward the door, but the child barred his way. "I'm British, and my father is up there with the cannon of the Marine. He will shoot you if you are a spy." They faced each other for a moment, then sighing, he bent over and kissed the child. "Pray for France, little one," he murmured, and she repeated with a pale smile, "For France and you, sir." He ran across the street and through the gateway. Once again, he edged into the line and shouldered his way along the road. A corporal passed, looked at him, repassed, and finally called an officer. "You belong to the 60th, he growled, the corporal looking at the number on his hat. I'm starting to do the same thing I did with the falconry one, where I'm just gonna contextually parse the words and try to substitute them. "We have no use for your kind," added the officer, catching sight of his black trousers. "I wish to volunteer in place of a comrade," said Trent, and the officer shrugged his shoulders and passed on. Nobody paid much attention to him, one or two merely glancing at his trousers. Guess it's like he's not fully in uniform. The road was deep with slush and mud plowed and torn by wheels and hoofs. A soldier in front of him wrenched his foot in an icy rut and dragged himself to the edge of the embankment, groaning. The plain on either side of them was gray with melting snow. Here and there, behind dismantled hedgerows, stood wagons bearing white flags with red crosses. Sometimes the driver was a priest in rusty hat and gown, sometimes a crippled mobile. Once they passed a wagon driven by a Sister of Charity, silent empty houses with great rents in their walls and every window blank, huddled along the road. Further on, within the zone of danger, nothing of human habitation remained, except here and there a pile of frozen bricks or a blackened cellar choked with snow. For some time, Trent had been annoyed by the man behind him, who kept treading on his heel. Convinced at last that it was intentional, he turned to remonstrate and found himself face to face with a fellow student from the Beaux Arts. Trent stared. "I thought you were in the hospital." The other shook his head, pointing to his bandaged jaw. "I see, you can't speak. Can I do anything?" The wounded man rummaged in his haversack and produced a crust of black bread. "He can't eat it. His jaw is smashed, and he wants you to chew it for him," said the soldier next to him. Trent took the crust and, grinding it in his teeth, morsel by morsel, passed it back to the starving man. From time to time, mounted orderlies sped to the front, covering them with slush. It was a chilly, silent march through the sodden meadows, wreathed in fog. Along the railroad embankment, across the ditch, another column moved parallel to their own. Trent watched it, a somber mass, now distinct, now vague, now blotted out in a puff of fog. Once for half an hour he lost it, but when again it came into view, he noticed a thin line detach itself from the flank, and, bellying in the middle, swung rapidly to the west. At the same moment, a prolonged crackling broke out in the fog in front. Other lines began to slough off from the column, swinging east and west, and the crackling became continuous. A battery passed at full gallop, and he drew back with his comrades to give it way. It went into action a little to the right of his battalion, and as the shot from the first rifled piece boomed through the mist, the cannon from the fortifications opened with a mighty roar. An officer galloped by, shouting something which Trent did not catch, but he saw the ranks in front and suddenly part company with his own and disappear in the twilight. More officers rode up and stood beside him, peering in the fog. Away in front, the crackling had become one prolonged crash. It was dreary waiting. Trent chewed some bread for the man behind, who tried to swallow it, and after a while shook his head, motioning Trent to eat the rest himself. The corporal offered him a little brandy, and he drank it, but when he turned around to return the flask, the corporal was lying on the ground. Alarmed, he looked at the soldier next to him, who shrugged his shoulder and opened his mouth to speak, but something struck him and he rolled over and over into the ditch below. At that moment, the horse of one of the officers gave a bound and backed into the battalion, lashing out with his heels. One man was ridden down, another was kicked in the chest and hurled through the ranks. The officer sank his spurs into the horse, in a calming way, a gentle way, and forced him to the front again, where he stood trembling. The cannonade seemed to draw nearer. A staff officer, riding slowly up and down the battalion, suddenly collapsed in his saddle and clung to his horse's mane. One of his boots dangled, crimson and dripping, from the stirrup. Then, out of the mist in front, men came running. The roads, the fields, the ditches were full of them, and many of them fell. For an instant he imagined he saw horsemen riding about like ghosts in the vapors beyond, and a man behind him cursed horribly, declaring he too had seen them, and that they were Uhlans, but the battalion stood inactive, and the mist fell across again over the meadows. The colonel sat heavily upon his horse, his bullet-shaped hat buried in the astrakhan collar of his dolman, his fat legs sticking straight out in the stirrups. The buglers clustered about him with bugles poised, and behind him a staff officer in a pale blue jacket smoked a cigarette and chatted with the captain of the hussars. From the road in front came the sound of furious galloping, and an orderly reined up beside the colonel, who motioned him to the rear without turning his head. Then on the left a confused murmur arose which ended in a shout. A hussar passed like the wind, followed by another and another, and then squadron after squadron whirled by them into the sheeted mists. At that instant the colonel reared in his saddle, the bugles clanged, and the whole battalion scrambled down the embankment, over the ditch, and started across the soggy meadow. Almost at once Trent lost his cap. Something snatched it from his head, and he thought it was a tree branch. A good many of his comrades rolled over in the slush and ice, and he imagined that they had slipped. They just slipped. They'll be back to their feet in a moment. They just need to catch their breath, you know? They're a little winded. One pitched right across his path, and he stopped to help him up, but the man screamed when he touched him, and an officer shouted, "Forward! Forward!" So he ran on again. It was a long jog through the mist, and he was often obliged to shift his rifle. When at last they lay panting behind the railroad embankment, he looked about him. He had felt the need of action, of a desperate physical struggle, of killing and crushing. He had been seized with the desire to fling himself among the masses and tear right and left. I mean, you got the other half left. That's, you know, you got two hemispheres of brain, you got 2 arms and hands, 2 legs and feet, 2 lungs. You got a lot of spares in there. All the juicy bits have some redundancy. Let's see, where were we? He longed to fire, to use the thin, sharp bayonet on his rifle. He had not expected this. He wished to become exhausted, to struggle and cut, until incapable of lifting his arm. Then he had intended to go home. Just for a little berserker outing, you know, a little bloodshed, little mayhem, until he got all tuckered out, and then he'd go home and have a sleep. Hey, honey. How was the killing today? Oh, you know, same old, same old. He heard a man say that half the battalion had gone down in the charge, and he saw another examining a corpse under the embankment. The body, still warm, was clothed in a strange uniform. But even when he noticed the spiked helmet laying a few inches further away, he did not realize what had happened. I mean, especially in the era they're heading into, there's a, the era that they're still in, before the era that they're heading into, that, the passion needs to be a lot sharper to be a soldier in these cases. The affixed bayonets thing is a lot more real in this scenario, or a lot more frequent. The colonel sat on his horse a few feet to the left, his eyes sparkling under his crimson hat. Trent heard him reply to an officer, "I can hold it, but another charge and I won't have enough men left to sound a bugle." "Were the Prussians here?" Trent asked a soldier who sat wiping the blood trickling from his hair. "Yes, the hussars cleared them out. We caught their crossfire." "We're supporting a battery on the embankment," said another. Then the battalion crawled over the embankment and moved along the lines of twisted rails. Trent rolled up his trousers and tucked them into his woolen socks. They halted again, and some of the men sat down on the dismantled railway track. Trent looked for his wounded comrade from the Beaux Arts. He was standing in his place, very pale. The cannonade had become terrific. For a moment the mist lifted, and he caught a glimpse of the 1st Battalion motionless on the railroad track in the front, of regiments on either flank, and then, as the fog settled again, the drum beat and the music of the bugles began away on the extreme left. A restless movement passed among the troops. The colonel threw up his arms, the drums rolled, and the battalion moved off through the fog. They were near the front now, for the battalion was firing as it advanced. Ambulances galloped along the base of the embankment to the rear, and the hussars passed and repassed like phantoms. They were in the front at last, for all about them was movement and turmoil. While from the fog, close at hand, came cries and groans and the crashing volleys. Shells fell everywhere, bursting along the embankment, splashing them with frozen slush. Trent was frightened. It's a little scary. That's just... I like that 3-word sentence where they're talking about being fired at and shelled in the late 19th century wars. And it's like, I was frightened. He began to dread the unknown, which lay there, crackling and flaming in obscurity. The shock of the cannon sickened him. He could even see the fog light up with the dull orange as thunder shook the earth. It was near, he felt certain, for the colonel shouted, "Forward!" Yeah. A bit it reminds me of the story with the first guy. How, the supremely unreliable narrator in the first story. One of the first things he did was very calmly described him reading the book and then saying like, yeah, and I figured I should stop reading. And then he gets up and hurls the book into the fire. There's a lot of sudden emotional shift in this guy. The 1st Battalion was hastened into it. He felt its breath, the trembling, but hurried on. A fearful discharge in front terrified him. Somewhere in the fog, men were cheering, and the colonel's horse, streaming with blood, plunged into the smoke. Another blast and shock, right in his face, almost stunned him, and he faltered. All the men to the right were down. His head swam. The fog and smoke stupefied him. He put out his hand for a support and caught something. It was the wheel of a gun carriage, and a man sprang from behind it, aiming a blow at his head with a rammer, but stumbled back, shrieking with a bayonet through his neck, and Trent knew that he had killed. Mechanically, he stooped to pick up his rifle, but the bayonet was still in the man, who lay, beating with red hands against the sod. It sickened him, and he leaned on the cannon. Men were fighting all around him now, and the air was foul with smoke and sweat. Somebody seized him from behind and another in front, and others in turn seized them or struck them with solid blows. The click, click, click of bayonets infuriated him. Again, it's the terminology that is used in some of these cases. It's that, he's getting into a frenzy hearing the sound, is I think what they're saying. But it sounds like all this noise of stabbing and, bayonets and killing, it's so irritating. Wish they would stop a little. Because the frenzy taking him lines up with this next sentence, and he grasped the rammer and struck out blindly until it was shivered to pieces. Oh, the sound of all these knives, it was just so irritating, so I decided I'm going to grab this stick and bash everything around me until the stick is broken. That'll solve the noise. That'll quiet it down. A man threw his arm around his neck and bore him to the ground, but he throttled him and raised himself on his knees. He saw a comrade seize the cannon and fall across it with a skull crushed in. He saw the colonel tumble clean out of his saddle into the mud, then consciousness fled. A man threw his... let's see. When he came to himself, he was lying on the embankment among the twisted rails. On every side huddled men who cried out and cursed and fled away into the fog. And he staggered to his feet and followed them. Once he stopped to help a comrade with a bandaged jaw, who could not speak but clung to his arm for a time, then fell dead in the freezing mire. And again he aided another who groaned. Looks like Trent, it's me, Philip, until a sudden volley in the mist relieved him of his charge. The guy that he thought he called out to when he joined with them. An icy wind swept down from the heights, cutting the fog into shreds. For an instant, with an evil leer, the sun peered through the naked woods of a place, sank like a blood clot into the battery smoke, lower and lower, until the blood-soaked into the blood-soaked plain. Now there's an image. Chapter 4. When midnight sounded from a belfry at St. Sulpice, the gates of Paris were still choked with fragments of what had once been an army. They entered with the night, a sullen horde, spattered with slime, faint with hunger and exhaustion. There was little disorder at first, and the throng at the gates parted silently as the soldiers tramped along the freezing street. Confusion came as the hours passed, swiftly and more swiftly, crowding squadron after squadron and battery on battery, horses plunging and jolting. The remnants from the front surged through the gates. A chaos of cavalry and artillery struggling for the right of way. That is the classic one, Tass. None of this is really what is being described, but his actions still line up. Sneeze. Makes sense. Much further, and we'd be getting into we'd be seeing more things akin to like trenches and machine guns, you know. Close upon them stumbled the infantry, here a skeleton of a regiment marching with a desperate attempt at order, there a riotous mob of mobiles crushing their way to the street, then a turmoil of horsemen, cannon, troops without, officers without men, then again a line of ambulances, the wheels groaning under their heavy loads. Dumb with misery, the crowd looked on. All through the day the ambulances had been arriving, and all day long the ragged throng whimpered and shivered by the barriers. At noon the crowd was increased tenfold, filling the squares about the gates, and swarming over the inner fortifications. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the German batteries suddenly wreathed themselves in smoke, and the shells fell fast. At 20 minutes after 4, 2 projectiles struck a house in the Rue de Bac, and a moment later the first shell fell in the Latin Quarter. Braith was panting in bed when West came in, very much scared. "I wish you would come down. Our house has been knocked into a cocked hat, and I'm afraid that some of the pillagers may take it in their heads to pay us a visit tonight." Braith jumped out of bed and bundled himself into a garment which had once been an overcoat. "Anybody hurt?" he inquired. struggling with a sleeve full of dilapidated lining. No, Colette is barricaded in the cellar, and the concierge ran away to the fortification. There will be a rough gang there if the bombardment keeps up. You might help us. Of course, said Braith, but it was not until they reached the Rue Serpent and had turned the passage which led to West Cellar that the latter cried, "Have you seen Jack Trent today?" No, replied Braith, looking troubled. He was not at ambulance headquarters. He stayed to take care of Sylvia, I suppose. A bomb came crashing through the roof of a house at the end of the alley and burst in the basement, showering the street with slate and plaster. A second struck a chimney and plunged into the garden, followed by an avalanche of bricks, and another exploded with a deafening report in the next street. They hurried along the passage to the steps which led to the cellar. Here again, Braith stopped. Don't you think I had better run up to see if Jack and Sylvia are well entrenched? I can get back before dark. No, go in and find Colette, and I'll go. No, let me go. There's no danger. I know it, replied West calmly, and dragging Braith into the alley, pointed to the cellar steps. The iron door was barred. Colette, he called. The door swung inward, and the girl sprang up the stairs to meet them. At that instant, Braith, glancing behind him, gave a startled cry, and pushing the two before him into the cellar, jumped down after them and slammed the iron door. A few seconds later, a heavy jar from the outside shook the hinges. There they are, muttered West, very pale. That door, observed Colette calmly, will hold forever. Braith examined the low iron structure, now trembling with the blows rained on it from without. West glanced anxiously at Colette, who displayed no agitation, and this comforted him. I don't believe they will spend much time here, said Braith. They only rummage in cellars for spirits, I imagine. Beverage. Oh yeah, this story is way longer than I anticipated. We're about 2/3 through the book. The last half of the book is these two stories. Whoops. So there might be another reading stream some point, but for now, onward. Unless they hear that valuables are buried there. But surely nothing is buried here, exclaimed Braith uneasily. Unfortunately there is, growled West, that miserly landlord of mine. The crash from outside, followed by a yell, cut him short. Then blow after blow shook the doors until there came a sharp snap. A crinkling of metal and a triangular bit of iron fell inward, leaving a hole through which struggled a ray of light. Instantly West knelt and shoved his revolver through the aperture, fired every single cartridge. Oh. Maybe you should save some bullets? For a moment, the alley resounded with the racket of the revolver, then absolute silence followed. Presently, a single questioning blow fell upon the door, and a moment later, another and another. Then a sudden crack zigzagged across the iron plate. Here, said West, seizing Colette by the wrist. You follow Braith. And he ran swiftly towards a circular spot of light at the further end of the cellar. The spot of light came from a barred manhole above. West motioned Braith to mount on his shoulders. Push it over, you must. With little effort, Braith lifted the barred cover, scrambled out on his stomach, and easily raised Colette from West's shoulders. Quick, old chap, cried the latter. Braith twisted his legs around a fence chain and leaned down again. The cellar was flooded with a yellow light, and the air reeked with a stench of petroleum torches. The iron door still held, but a whole metal plate was gone, and now as they looked, a figure came creeping through, holding a torch. Quick, whispered Braith, jump. And West hung dangling until Colette grasped him by the collar, and he was dragged out. Then her nerves gave way, and she wept hysterically, but West threw his arm around her and led her across the gardens into the next street, where Braith, after replacing the manhole cover and piling some stone slabs from the wall over it, rejoined them. It was almost dark. They hurried through the street, now only lighted by burning buildings, or the swift glare of the shells. They gave wide berth to the fires, but at a distance saw the flitting forms of pillagers among the debris. Sometimes they passed a female fury crazed with drink, shrieking anathemas upon the world, or some slouching lout whose blackened face and hands betrayed his share in the work of destruction. At last they reached the Seine and passed the bridge, and then Braith said, "I must go back. I'm not sure of Jack and Sylvia." As he spoke, he made way for a crowd which came tramping across the bridge and along the river wall by the d'Orsay barracks. In the midst of it, West caught the measured tread of a platoon. A lantern passed, a file of bayonets, and then another lantern which glimmered on the deathly face behind, and Colette gasped, "Hartman," and he was gone. They peered fearfully across the embankment, holding their breath. There was a shuffle of feet on the quay, and the gate of the barracks slammed. A lantern shone for a moment on the postern, and the crowd pressed to the grill. Then came the clang of a volley from the stone parade. One by one, the petroleum torches flared up along the embankment, and now the whole square was in motion. Let's see. The fragments of the battle straggled in, a company here and a mob there. They poured in from every street, followed by women and children, and a great murmur, borne on the icy wind, swept through the Arc de Triomphe and down the dark avenue. A ragged end of a battalion was pressing past, the specter of annihilation. West groaned. Then a figure sprang from the shadowy ranks and called West's name. And when he saw it was Trent, he cried out. Trent seized him, white with terror. "Sylvia?" West stared speechless, but Colette moaned, "Oh, Sylvia! And they are shelling the quarter." Trent, shouted Braith, but he was gone, and they could not overtake him. The bombardment ceased as Trent crossed the boulevard Saint-Germain, but the entrance to the Rue de Seine was blocked by a heap of smoking bricks. Everywhere the shells had torn great holes in the pavement. The cafe was a wreck of splinters and glass. The bookstore tottered, ripped from roof to basement. And the little bakery, long since closed, bulged outward above a mass of slate and tin. He climbed over the steaming bricks and hurried to the next street. On the corner, a fire blazed, lighting up his own street, and on the bank wall, beneath a shattered gas lamp, a child was writing with a bit of cinder. Here fell the first shell. The letters stared him in the face. The rat killer finished and stepped back to view his work, but catching the sight of Trent's bayonet, screamed and fled. And as Trent staggered across the shattered street, from holes and crannies in the ruins, fierce women fled from their work of pillage, cursing him. At first he could not find his house, for the tears blinded him. But he felt along the wall and reached the door. A lantern burned in the concierge's lodge, and the old man lay dead beside it. Faint with fright, he leaned a moment on his rifle, then, snatching the lantern, sprang up the stairs. He tried to call, but his tongue hardly moved. On the second floor, he saw plaster on the stairway. And on the third, the floor was torn and the concierge lay in a pool of blood across the landing. The next floor was his, theirs. The door hung from its hinges, the walls gaped. He crept in and sank down by the bed, and there 2 arms were flung around his neck, and a tear-stained face sought his own. "Sylvia! Oh, Jack!" From the tumbled pillow beside them, a child wailed. "They brought it. It is mine," she sobbed. Ours, he whispered, with his arms around them both. Then from the stairs below came Braith's anxious voice. Trent, is all well? So that story was essentially a period drama. Like a story from the war kind of thing. The strangest portion of it is the moment where he gets kind of swept up and joins the sortie. We don't really have a good basis for that not having happened, but it's the event, like that circumstance, was presented in an interesting fashion. So the next story is The Street of Our Lady of the Fields. And the opening poem is in French, so there you go. The street is not fashionable, neither is it shabby. It is a pariah among streets, a street without a quarter. It is generally understood to lie outside the pale of the aristocratic avenue. Observatory Avenue. The students of the nearby quarter consider it swell and will have none of it. So I guess in this context, it sounds like swell is a negative. The Latin Quarter, from the Luxembourg, its northern frontier, sneers at its respectability and regards with disfavor the correctly costumed students who haunt it. Okay, no, it's the aristocratic don't like it. The students like it. The Latin Quarter thinks it's too posh. Few strangers go into it. At times, however, the Latin Quarter students use it as a thoroughfare between two streets. But except for that, the weekly afternoon visits of parents and guardians to the convent near the street, near the other street, or the street of Our Lady of the Fields, is as quiet as a passy boulevard. Perhaps the most respectable portion lies between these two places. At least this was the conclusion arrived at by the Reverend Joel Byram, as he rambled through it with Hastings in charge. To Hastings, the street looked pleasant in the bright June weather, and he had begun to hope for its selection when the Reverend Byram shied violently at the cross on the convent opposite. Well, said Hastings wearily, I imagine we won't find anything better. You say yourself that vice is triumphant in Paris, and it seems to me that in every street we find Jesuits or something worse. After a moment he repeated, or something worse, which of course I would not notice except for your kindness in warning me. Dr. Byram sucked in his lips and looked about him. He was impressed by the evident respectability of the surroundings. Then, frowning at the convent, he took Hastings' arm and shuffled across the street to an iron gateway which bore the number 201, painted in white on a blue background. Below this was a notice painted in English. 1. For porter, please oppress once. For servant, please oppress twice. For parlor, please oppress thrice. Hastings touched the electric button 3 times, and they were ushered through the garden and into the parlor by a trim maid. The dining room door, just beyond, was open, and from the table in plain view a stout woman hastily arose and came toward them. Hastings caught a glimpse of a young man with a big head and several snuffy old gentlemen at breakfast. Before the door closed and the stout woman waddled into the room, bringing with her an aroma of coffee and a black poodle. It's a pleasure to receive you, she cried. Are you English? No? American? It's written with a really strong accent. Like speaking English with a really thick French accent is how they seem to have written this. I have a penchant for Americans. Here everybody speaks English. The personnel, the servants, plus I do a little. I am happy to have you. I'm happy to have you, madam, began Dr. Byram, but was cut short again. Yes, I know. You do not speak French, but you have come to learn. My husband does speak French. We have at the moment a family of Americans who learned French from my husband. Here the poodle growled at Dr. Byram and was promptly cuffed by his mistress. Looks like, essentially, you little villain. The poodle fled, and his mistress cried, let's see. Okay, so Hastings says something in French. She says you speak French well. I find it's hard to try to decipher try to spell a French accent speaking English, as it is to try to decipher the French from context. They went upstairs to examine Hastings' future quarters, test the bed springs, and arrange for the weekly towel allowance. Dr. Byram appeared satisfied. Madame Moreau accompanied them to the door and rang for the maid, but as Hastings stepped out into the gravel walk, his guide and mentor paused for a moment and fixed the madam with his watery eyes. You understand, he said, that he is a youth of most careful bringing up, and his character and morals are without a stain. He is young and he has never been abroad, never even seen a large city, and his parents have requested me, as an old family friend living in Paris, to see that he is placed under good influences. He is to study art, but on no account would his parents wish him to live in the Latin Quarter if they knew of the immorality which is rife there. A sound like the click of a latch interrupted him, and he raised his eyes, but not in time to see the maid slap the big-headed young man behind the parlor door. Madame coughed, cast a deadly glance behind her, and then beamed at Dr. Byram. It's good that he's come here. She announced with conviction. Again, it's a combination of trying to incorporate the accent and kind of misstructuring of a sentence in English with French at times. Hastings looked at the convent until a pretty girl passed before the gray facade. Then he looked at her. A young fellow with a paint box and canvas came swinging along, stopped before the pretty girl, said something during a brief but vigorous handshake, at which they both laughed, and he went his way, calling back something. Which included the name Valentine, or Valentine. Don't know how it would be pronounced in this. We're going to say Valentine. Thought Hastings, what a quaint name. And he started to follow the Reverend Joel Byram, who was shuffling toward the nearest tramway station. Well, that was an awkward chapter. Let's see if we have more butchered French English going on during this. Chapter 2. We will have more of that. Are you pleased with Paris, sir? Demanded Madame Moreau the next morning as Hastings came into the breakfast room of the pension, rosy from his plunge in the limited bath above. I'm sure I shall like it, he replied, wondering at his own depression of spirits. Some buttons here. The maid brought him coffee and rolls. He returned the vacant glance of the big-headed young man and I'm reminded of Invader Zim. How they keep calling out that one of the main characters, Dib, has a big head. Culminating in two particular instances, the Halloween special, where there's a cascade moment where they keep each successive reference is bigger. In this case, it's every time they reference the guy, they're saying big-headed. Like, is that the only distinguishing characteristic of the person? They're not going to introduce name or give them any sort of other introduction other than, look at the head on that one. He returned the vacant glance of the big-headed young man and acknowledged diffidently the salutes of the snuffy old gentleman. He did not try to finish his coffee and sat crumbling a roll, unconscious of the sympathetic glances of Madame Moreau, who had tact enough not to bother him. Presently a maid entered with a tray on which were balanced 2 bowls of chocolate, and the snuffy old gentleman leered at her ankles. It's another sign of the times. Leered at her ankles. The maid deposited the chocolate at the table near the window and smiled at Hastings. Then a thin young lady, followed by her counterpart in all except years, marched into the room and looked at the table near the window. And took the table near the window. People from the time period that brought us tablecloths to prevent men from getting the wrong ideas about table legs. Marched into the room and took the table near the window. They were evidently American, but Hastings, if he expected any sign of recognition, was disappointed. To be ignored by compatriots intensified his depression. He fumbled with his knife and looked at his plate. The thin young lady was talkative enough. She was quite aware of Hastings' presence, ready to be flattered if he looked at her. But on the other hand, she felt her superiority, for she had been 3 weeks in Paris, and he, it was easy to see, had not yet unpacked his steamer trunk. Her conversation was complacent. She argued with her mother upon the relative merits of the Louvre versus in the Bon Marché. But her mother's part of the discussion was mostly confined to the observation, why Susie? I mean, from the sounds of it, the girl that has come in has some of the stereotype of American tourists. But we'll see if it escalates to modern stereotype levels. The snuffy old gentleman had left the room in a body, outwardly polite and inwardly raging. They could not endure the Americans, who filled the room with their chatter. There we go. There we go. The big-headed young man looked after them with a knowing cough, murmuring, "Old birds. We're gonna truncate that because there's not a contextual enough usage for the term." "They look like bad old men, Mr. Bladen," said the girl. To this Mr. Bladen smiled and said, "They've had their day," in a tone which implied that he was now having his. "That's why they all have baggy eyes," cried the girl. "I think it's a shame for young gentlemen." "Why, Susie," said the mother, and the conversation lagged. After a while, Mr. Bladen threw down the petite journal which he daily studied at the expense of the house, and turning to Hastings, started to make himself agreeable. He began by saying, "I see you are American." To this brilliant and original opening, Hastings, deadly homesick, replied gratefully, and the conversation was judiciously nourished by observations from Miss Susie Bing, or Byng. It's B-Y-N-G. I'm gonna say Bing. Distinctly addressed to Mr. Bladen. In the course of events, Miss Susie, forgetting to address herself exclusively to Mr. Bladen, and Hastings replied to her general question. The entente cordial, the good intentions, I think, was established, and Susie and her mother extended a protectorate over what was clearly neutral territory. "Mr. Hastings, you must not desert the pension every evening as Mr. Bladen does. Paris is an awful place for young gentlemen, and Mr. Bladen is a horrid cynic." Mr. Bladen looked gratified. It's good to be known. "I shall be at the studio all day, and I imagine I shall be glad enough to come back at night," Hastings answered. Mr. Bladen, who, at a salary of $15 a week, acted as agent for the Pewley Manufacturing Company of Troy, New York, smiled a skeptical smile and withdrew to keep an appointment with a customer on the Boulevard Magenta. Hastings walked into the garden with Miss Bing and Susie, and, at their invitation, sat down in the shade before the iron gate. The chestnut tree still bore their fragrant spikes of pink and white, and the bees hummed among the roses trellised on the white-walled house. A faint freshness was in the air. The watering carts moved up and down the street, and a clear stream bubbled over the spotless gutters of the street. The sparrows were merry among the curbstones, taking bath after bath in the water and ruffling their feathers with delight. In a walled garden across the street, a pair of blackbirds whistled among the almond trees. Hastings swallowed the lump in his throat, for the song of the birds and the ripple of the water in a Paris gutter brought back to him the sunny meadows of Millbrook. "That's a blackbird," observed Miss Bing. "See him there in the bush with pink blossoms. He's all black except his bill, and that looks as if it had been dipped in an omelette, as some Frenchman says." "Why, Susie," said Mrs. Bing. "That garden belongs to a studio inhabited by 2 Americans," continued the girl serenely, "and I often see them pass. They seem to need a great many models, mostly young and feminine. Why, Susie! Perhaps they prefer painting that kind, but I don't see why they should invite 5 with 3 more young gentlemen, and all get into 2 cabs and drive away singing." "Oh. This street," she continued, "is dull. There is nothing to see except the garden and a glimpse of the nearby boulevard through the street. No one ever passes except a policeman. There is a convent on the corner." On one side stands the palatial hotels of John Paul Laurens and another place. And opposite, in the little passage, an artist, and let's see, Carolus Duran paints the masterpieces which charm the world. There's a whole lot of, here are all the intricate places surrounding them, but they end up being names floating in space. Like, you get some hint how they're connected, but you end up knowing like little single facts about them. It could be that they're all one cluster, they could be spread in a circle. I don't know. But they're just indicating all this stuff is nearby. Chapter 3. The Luxembourg was a blaze of flowers. He walked slowly through the long avenues of trees, past mossy marbles and old-time columns, and threading the grove by the Bronze Lion came upon the tree-crowned terrace above the fountain. Below lay the basin shining in the sunlight. Flowering almonds encircled the terrace, and in a greater spiral, groves of chestnuts wound in and out and down among the moist thickets by the western palace wing. At one end of the avenue of trees, the observatory rose, its white domes piled up like an eastern mosque, and at the other end stood a heavy palace, with every window pane ablaze in the fierce sun of June. Around the fountain, children and white-capped nurses armed with bamboo poles were pushing toy boats, whose sails hung limp in the sunshine. A dark policeman, wearing red epaulettes and a dress sword, watched them for a while and then went away to remonstrate with a young man who had unchained his dog. The dog was pleasantly occupied in rubbing grass and dirt into his back, while his legs waved into the air. A very dog. The policeman pointed at the dog. He was speechless with indignation. So, I like the phrasing of that. This is one of those uncertain meaning kind of pair of sentences. Is it that the policeman pointed at the dog and the policeman was speechless with indignation? Or is it the policeman pointed at the dog and the dog was speechless with indignation? Good times. I like to think the latter. Well, Captain, smiled the young gentleman. Well, Mr. Student, growled the policeman. What do you come and complain to me for? If you don't chain him, I'll take him, shouted the policeman. What's that to me, Captain? What? Isn't that bulldog yours? Well, if it was, don't you suppose I'd chain him? Bit of a comedy routine going on. The officer glared for a moment in silence, then deciding that as he was a student he was wicked, grabbed at the dog, who promptly dodged. Around and around the flower beds they raced, and when the officer came too near for comfort, the bulldog cut across the flower bed, which perhaps was not playing fair. He is being outmaneuvered. The young man was amused, and the dog also seemed to enjoy the exercise. The policeman noticed this and decided to strike at the fountainhead of the evil. He stormed up to the student and said, "As the owner of this public nuisance, I arrest you." "But," objected the other, "I disclaimed the dog." That was a poser. It was useless to attempt to catch the dog until 3 gardeners lent a hand, but then the dog simply ran away and disappeared down the street. The policeman shambled off to find consolation among the white-capped nurses, and the student looked at his watch, stood up yawning. Then, catching sight of Hastings, he smiled and bowed. Hastings walked over to the marble, laughing. "Why, Clifford," he said, "I didn't recognize you." "It's my mustache," sighed the other. "I sacrificed it to humor a whim of a friend." "What do you think of my dog?" "Then he is yours," cried Hastings. "Of course, it's a pleasant change for him, this playing tag with policemen. But he is known now, and I'll have to stop it. He's gone home. He always does when the gardeners take a hand. It's a pity, he's fond of rolling on lawns." Then they chatted for a moment of Hastings' prospects, and Clifford politely offered to stand his sponsor at the studio. "You see, old Tabby, I mean Dr. Byram, told me about you before I met you," explained Clifford. "And Elliot and I will be glad to do anything we can." Then, looking at his watch again, he muttered, "I have just 10 minutes to catch the Versailles train. Goodbye." He started to go, but catching sight of a girl advancing by the fountain, took off his hat with a confused smile. "Why are you not at the Versailles?" she said, with an almost imperceptible acknowledgement of Hastings' presence. "I'm going," murmured Clifford. For a moment they faced each other, and then Clifford, very red, stammered, "With your permission, I have the honor of presenting to you my friend, Monsieur Hastings." Hastings bowed low, and she smiled very sweetly, but there was something of malice in the quiet inclination of her small Parisian head. "I could have wished," she said, "that Mr. Clifford might spare me more time than he brings with him, so charming an American." Must I go, Valentine?" began Clifford. "Certainly," she replied. "Well, then. She is most definitely in charge in that relationship." Let's see. Clifford took his leave with very bad grace, wincing when she added, "And give my dearest love to Cecile," as he disappeared down the street. The girl turned as if to go, but then suddenly remembering Hastings, looked at him and shook her head. "Mr. Clifford is so perfectly harebrained," she smiled. "It is embarrassing sometimes." "You have heard, of course, all about his success at the salon?" He looked puzzled, and she noticed it. "You have been to the salon, of course?" "Why, no," he answered. "I've only arrived in Paris 3 days ago." She seemed to pay little heed to his explanation, but continued, "Nobody imagined he had the energy to do anything good." Beverage. But on varnishing day, the salon was astonished by the entrance of Mr. Clifford, who strolled about as bland as you please, with an orchid in his buttonhole and a beautiful picture on the line. She smiled to herself at the reminiscence and looked at the fountain. Mr. Bouguereau told me that Mr. Julian was so astonished that he only shook hands with Mr. Clifford in a dazed manner, and actually forgot to pat him on the back. Fancy," she continued with much merriment, "fancy Papa Julian forgetting to pat one on the back." An important part of the ceremonial gestures, I guess. This back patting. Hastings, wondering at her acquaintance with the great, I think it's Bouguereau. We'll go with Bouguereau. It's almost certainly not, but that's what it is now. Looked at her with respect. "May I ask," he said diffidently, "whether you are a pupil of Bouguereau?" "Aye," she said in some surprise. Then she looked at him curiously. Was he permitting himself the liberty of joking on such short acquaintance? His pleasant, serious face questioned hers. What a droll man, she thought. "You surely study art," he said. She leaned back on the crooked stick of her parasol and looked at him. "Why do you think so?" "Because you speak as if you did." "You're making fun of me," she said, "and it is not good taste." She stopped, confused, as he colored to the roots of his hair. "How long have you been in Paris?" she said at length. 3 days, he replied gravely. "But surely you're not new. You speak French too well." Then, after a pause, "Really? You're new?" "I am," he said. She sat down on the marble bench lately occupied by Clifford, and, tilting her parasol over his small head, looked at him. "I don't believe it." He felt the compliment, and for a moment hesitated to declare himself one of the despised. Then, mustering up his courage, he told her how new and green he was, and all with a frankness which made her blue eyes open very wide and her lips part in the sweetest of smiles. "You've never seen a studio?" "Never. Nor a model?" "No." "How funny," she said solemnly. Then they both laughed. And you, have you seen studios? Hundreds. And models? Millions. And you know Bogoro? Yes, and Henner and Constant and Lawrence and Puvis Cavanes and Dangan and Courtois and all the rest of them. And yet you say you're not an artist. Pardon, she said gravely. Did I say I was not? Won't you tell me? He hesitated. At first she looked at him and, shaking her head and smiling, then of a sudden her eyes fell and began tracing figures with her parasol in the gravel at her feet. Hastings had taken a place on the seat now, with his elbows on his knees, sat watching the spray drifting from the fountain jet. A small boy, dressed as a sailor, stood poking his yacht and crying, "I won't go home. I won't go home." His nurse raised her hands to the heavens. Just like a little American boy, thought Hastings, and a pang of homesickness shot through him. Presently the nurse captured the boat, and the small boy stood at bay. Mr. Rene, when you decide to come here, you may have your boat. The boy backed away, scowling. Give me my boat, I say, he cried. And don't call me Rene, for my name's Randall, and you know it. Hello, said Hastings. Randall, that's English. I'm American, announced the boy in perfectly good English, turning to look at Hastings, and she's such a fool to call me Rene, because Mama calls me Ranny. Here he dodged the exasperated nurse and took up his station behind Hastings, who laughed and, catching him around the waist, lifted him onto his lap. One of my countrymen, he said to the girl beside him. She smiled while he spoke, but there was a strange feeling in his throat. Don't you see the stars and stripes on my yacht? Demanded Randall. Sure enough, the American colors hung limply under the nurse's arm. Oh, cried the girl, he is charming, and impulsively stooped to kiss him. But the infant Randall wriggled out of Hastings' arms, and the nurse pounced upon him, with an angry glance at the girl. She reddened and then bit her lips as the nurse, with eyes still fixed on her, dragged the child away and ostensibly wiped his lips with her handkerchief. Another one of those things of the time, since, apparently she bent down and kissed him on the lips almost randomly. What an ill-tempered woman, he said. In America, most nurses are flattered when people kiss their children. For an instant, she tipped the parasol to hide her face, then closed it with a snap and looked at him defiantly. Do you think it strange that she objected? Why not? He said in surprise. Again, she looked at him with quick, searching eyes. His eyes were clear and bright, and he smiled back, repeating, Why not? You are droll, she murmured, bending her head. But why? But she made no answer and sat silent, tracing curves and circles in the dust with her parasol. After a while, he said, I am glad to see that young people have so much liberty here. I understood that the French were not at all like us. In America, at least where I lived in Millbrook, girls have every liberty, go out alone and receive their friends alone, and I was afraid that I should miss it here. But I see how it is now, and I'm glad I was mistaken. She raised her eyes to his and kept them there. He continued pleasantly, Since I have sat here, I have seen a lot of pretty girls walking alone on the terrace to there. And then you are alone too. Tell me, for I do not know French customs, do you have the liberty of going to the theater without a chaperone? For a long time she studied his face, and then with a trembling smile said, Why do you ask me? Oh, excuse me. Because you must know, of course, he said. Yes, she replied indifferently. I know. He glanced for a while, but getting none, decided that perhaps she had misunderstood him. I hope you don't think I mean to presume on our short acquaintance, he began. In fact, it is very odd, but that I don't know your name. When Mr. Clifford presented me, he only mentioned mine. Is that the custom in France? It is the custom in the Latin Quarter, she said, with a strange light in her eyes. Then suddenly she began to talk almost feverishly. You must know, Mr. Hastings, that we're all very bohemian here in the Latin Quarter, and etiquette and ceremony are out of place. It was for that Mr. Clifford presented you to me with small ceremony and left us together with less. Only for that, and I am his friend, and I have many friends in the Latin Quarter. And we all know each other very well, and I am not studying art, but... But what? He said, bewildered. I shall not tell you. It is a secret, she said with an uncertain smile. On both cheeks a pink spot was burning, and her eyes were very bright. Do you know Mr. Clifford very intimately? Not very. After a while she turned to him, grave and a little pale. My name is Valentine, and I'm going to say Tissot. Might I ask a service of you on very short notice, on such very short acquaintance? Oh, he cried, I should be honored. It is only this, she said gently. It is not much. Promise me not to speak to Mr. Clifford about me. Promise me that you will speak to no one else about me. I promise, he said, greatly puzzled. She laughed nervously. I wish to remain a mystery. It is a caprice. But, he began, I had hoped that you might give Mr. Clifford permission to bring me, to present me at your house. My house? I mean, where you live, and, in fact, to present me to your family. The change in the girl's face shocked him. I beg your pardon, he cried. Have I hurt you? And as quick as a flash, she understood him because she was a woman. My parents are dead, she said. Presently he began again, very gently. Would it displease you if I begged you to receive me? It is the custom. I cannot, she answered. Then, glancing up at him, I am sorry. I should like to, but believe me, I cannot. All right, I think I'm reaching my limit suddenly, folks. Did not sleep very well last night. So, we're going to have another stream of this, potentially shorter. I don't know when. Likely next week. I'll probably put it early if I do, to wrap this up. But I'm starting to nod a little bit, and I don't want the spaces between sentences to get even longer. Oh dear. Yeah, both of these have been period pieces. I might have to skim this one and see if we're going to get any more, because if we don't get anything super interesting, we'll just skip it and say that that in reading the first few, we read the actual King in Yellow. This, get my bookmark here. Now, let's see here. Well, again, a little bit dry. Well, noticeably dry. Our next streams are going to be on Saturday and Sunday. We are going to be playing. Let me verify the sequence. We are going to be playing Cuphead on Saturday. Never played it before, seen it. Don't know, like, the actual tactile mechanics of the game, but I am aware of some of them. And then on Sunday, we're going to try excuse me again. We're going to try a newish game, early access game called Thronefall, which seems to be a bit of a combo of a sort of roguelite fighting game with a bit of city building. Like active action city building, it seems. So that could be neat. In the meantime, I'm going to check and see if I can find a channel to raid along to. I do, Miss Strangest. I do speak English. I speak only English, that is. As our reading tonight would show, I very much don't speak or read French. Set this up here. Looks like I don't have an upcoming one to redirect you folks to. I'm trying to work on getting a stable of channels and hopefully getting a bit of getting more of those redirects at the end so that we can move along to another stream if you folks like. But that's clearly still a work in progress. I'm not familiar so much with Ruby, Strangest, though I have some experience with JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. Not my favorite things in the world by far, but, you know, tools are tools. But yes, you are catching us right at the end of the stream here. We were reading The King in Yellow today. And we may have a finish-up stream for it. It's going to depend on what the actual content of this last story is, which I will be checking over before I make any plans. But again, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And I hope you have a good time for the rest of the evening. Good night, everybody.